Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
Alrighty. Well, welcome to part 2 of Science, Method or Madness. As you can see, there's the usual 4 of us, plus there's 2 more sort of special friends of the pod we've brought on to give some context. So Mikey is a friend of ours from uni, so is Max. Mikey did computer science and has had some pretty interesting stuff to contribute over the past sort of year in terms of furthering the rest of our understandings of like logic and how that fits in. And then Max did a module on the history and philosophy of science while he was at uni, and sort of finished up in experimental psychology. So he's got a bunch of sort of interesting perspectives from there as well. And you're now doing, if I'm correct, you're doing a master's at LSE.
Yes.
And yeah, Max is gonna sort of give a more formal summary of last time, of like all our different standpoints from last time, from a kind of history and philosophy of science kind of academic perspective, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna try from what I can remember. Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. So I think you all realise that so everyone has this sort of rough view that science, there's this thing called science, there's like scientific method, and basically scientists do science and they work out what the world is like, and it should be as simple as that. But actually, when you sort of analyse science itself, it all seems to fall apart. And you open this great big can of worms where like, you think, what is science? What is scientific method? Does it actually make any sense? Like, is it actually working? And like, yeah. And this happened like 100 years ago in philosophy of science. And the last 100 years have been like lots of big debates about sort of reality, how science relates to it, how scientists work, like what is sort of the methodology of science. So you really hit on all the main points. I think one thing that you got stuck into is the idea of sort of realism. Like, is there an objective reality? So Rob was quite strongly for this. Rob was like, yes, objective reality is a thing. He was slightly pessimistic. He's like, I'm not entirely sure if we can actually, like, how well we can observe it as scientists. But Rob was very confident that it existed. Zoe was a bit sort of agnostic. She wasn't quite sure about the ideas, which is fair enough. That's probably the best way to be. Then actually Emma was very sort of, I think she had an idea that objective reality might exist. But she was very pessimistic into actually how good science was at like coming up with that objective reality. And she pointed to a lot of the problems, like, is science objective? Is science held up as this sort of objective, this is just the facts, but is it actually like that? And a lot of people said science isn't like that. So Emma's very pessimistic. Then Syl saw the wild card. Syl's like, I don't care. Nuclear decay isn't random, like anything goes. So yeah, I think that's basically what's going on. But Syl actually raises a good point, because like when you say nuclear decay is random, like what does that actually mean? And really, like, that is sort of like the sort of, in a nutshell, that's science. Like, we say it's random because it's the best explanation we have. Like, of the data, it looks like nuclear decay looks random. And like, that's the best way to explain it at the moment. But like, are we sure? Like, yeah, there's that, until something better comes along, that's the best way to say it. So see science as a sort of evolutionary process as well. So I think that's basically what you talked about last time.
Amazing. Thank you for that. It's great hearing your own ideas relayed back to you.
Yeah, you did make sense. That's probably a good thing, isn't it?
We made sense. That's what we want. Yeah, I wanted to ask actually just a bit more, because you studied the sort of history and philosophy of science. You said sort of 100 years ago, people started questioning maybe the legitimacy of science. I wondered if like what started that, or what were the kind of what were the first things that happened around then that made people start to question it?
Yeah, sure. So basically science, the philosophy of science really started with some Austrian guys called the logical positivists, sort of just after World War One, and they were like, oh, we can use logic to say, oh, this is a real thing, and then they're like, oh, if we observe that happening, if we can confirm that what's like the statement we've constructed using logic is happening in the real world, then that's science. So they're like, oh, this is really logical, it's very easy to do, like we don't need to think about anything else. So that was them, and then another guy came along called Karl Popper, and his idea of falsificationism, that's quite hard to say, and he was like, there's some problems with the logical positivists, because you can't really confirm, it's quite hard to confirm things. Like if you try and say like this metal is expanding, like what does that mean? And like it's not necessarily like true that it's always going to be the case. And so he came along and said science works by, if you disprove something, if you say this isn't true, then that's science, and then the new thing comes along, so you disprove stuff, and then basically things went to shit after that. But like this guy called Thomas Kuhn came along and was like, science doesn't work like that at all. All these people came along, sort of feminist scientists, postmodern sort of philosophers of science, are like, yeah, science, like people realize that science didn't really have a method. Like it all falls apart. You can't really like pin it down. And then like the last sort of 40, 50 years have all been just like, what can we do with this? So that's basically what happened.
And have they done anything useful with it? Because it seemed to me like it's a pretty reliable, or like
yeah, I mean
now it's a pretty reliable method anyway.
I mean, that's the thing, like science, like, you can talk about the philosophy of science as much as you like, but science still goes on. Like it's not as if science has stopped since then. And I think people have come to realize that like basically Rob is sort of quite close to the position. So between Rob and Emma, there is like, yeah, you can have that, and that's quite a reasonable position to have, that science, we're aware that science is, as a sort of a collection of knowledge, it's quite, I would say it's probably approaching objective reality, and that's quite a common view that, yeah, science describes objective reality, but there are a lot of things that get in the way of that, like psychology being like how you actually think about how, like, you have to, like, knowledge is constructed by what we perceive, so that limits how much we know and like how we know things, stuff like, and then like the sociology of science, so like that's quite big areas, like how scientists interact and like how like they generate, sort of how they publish papers, like who reads their papers, that limits and that shapes science as well. So there's all these things that limit science, but I think science as a body of knowledge is pretty trusted, yeah, these days.
Yeah, the psychology one's interesting. I mean, I know it's sort of a bit of a segue, but I was trying to think, when I re-listened to the podcast, I was thinking about like causality, because that came up, and kind of things that could be considered immaterial. And aside from kind of one-way interactions with a kind of immaterial reality that you can't ever understand because you can't get an input and an output when you do an experiment on it. So unless it's like that, the only kind of immaterial thing I could think of was, interestingly, like free will, because that's causal, but by definition you can't like predict it or know what happens, because if you did, then it wouldn't be free.
Well, yeah, you hit on that's quite a big point, and this is a big debate. So yeah, obviously I'm a psychologist, and a lot of psychology is basically experimental philosophy. It's like all these ideas we've had in philosophy for thousands of years, from sort of Plato to Descartes to whoever, basically. Psychology is about actually sort of putting a bit of scientific method to that. And one of these is, yeah, like the mind. And so we're fairly confident that obviously people have mental states. You have thoughts, feelings, free will, consciousness. But these aren't physical things. These aren't, they're not like electrons or anything, or pens or anything. Like, these are physical things. Mental states obviously something a bit different. And if you think of it, like how do these cause things? Like, how can these non-physical things cause physical acts to happen? So like, if Rob decides to sort of down that bottle of whiskey and like next to him, obviously there's a physical thing going on there. The whiskey's going somewhere, it's moving.
No.
Rob's throwing up probably. But there's something mental. Rob's deciding to do that. That's causing it. So that's a really interesting problem in sort of philosophy generally. And the way that people solve that is basically to say, so every time you have a thought or a feeling, sort of attached to that is a physical process. So your thought has a sort of physical correlate basically. And it's that, so there's no sort of weird like one-way causation like Rob was referring to. Like it's the physical correlate of your mental state.
Yeah, it's two-way. If it's free will, it can be, Sorry.
I have an interesting point as well, because I remember from my second year studying neurobiology, which also I believe Rob and Brosnahan both did with me.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Good times.
You thought
I was clever till the exams came along.
Yeah. But there was. I remember one interesting point I believe we discussed in this revision at one point. I don't know if you guys did the same, maybe not. But there was a point where they've recently discovered that, or they've recently observed that in the brain, there's obviously different sections of the brain. Max does psychology putting this, but maybe like there's the motor section, the motor cortex, which controls the actual movement and sends the impulses to the muscles, which causes a response. And then there's also the kind of I believe it's the frontal cortex, which is involved in decision making and can almost stimulate you moving something. And obviously these brain regions are not precise. The brain is incredibly complex, and we don't know for sure anything about the brain really. However, I remember one thing they observed was actually when someone moved something, or like when someone was told move your arm to grab something, they've actually observed that there were stimulations at that point in the motor cortex before there were stimulations in the frontal lobe, or the decision-making part of the brain, which seems to suggest, and I think we discussed this, that potentially, how can I have
audio input reflexes, basically.
Yeah.
But as in, so it was almost you moved your arm before you decide to move your arm, which is
yes, that is an experiment. It's quite a famous experiment. It's this premotor area, isn't it? That sort of activates before the conscious parts of your brain sort of kick in.
In fact, you both remember
that. That is a bit confusing. It's quite hard to know what to make of that. Like, because it does say something about free will, that
exactly
if we're not conscious of our actions, if something's going on before our actions.
But there's plenty of unconscious decisions that we make that we could say are not part of our free will, but there are some decisions that you really think a lot about, and it's still very much up in the air whether it's actually us that's deciding anything, or whether it's just all sort of either preordained or kind of randomly kind of dice rolled on the day, or whether it's actually us kind of formulating these thoughts and making a decision. But if it is us formulating these thoughts and making a decision, and that will is free, then that sort of means it's a will that can't be predicted, but also is one that's causal, which kind of makes it like it would be almost by definition something science could not discover, explain. It would be something science could discover but not explain, and therefore sort of something that would probably be considered, I guess, immaterial. And the brain, as we all know from that very first neuroscience lecture, where the guy harped on about it for about an hour, was just like, we know nothing, we know nothing, we know nothing. Anyone who tells you they understand the brain is lying to you. We know nothing. So yeah, I think there's very much scope in psychology, neuroscience, and kind of the mind for plenty of scientific speculation, or extra science sort of bandwidth, shall we say. Pretty much it's all extra scientific bandwidth, shall we say.
I think this potentially hits on one thing which perhaps a lot of like conventional science isn't so good at responding to, is things that don't work in a sort of linear causal way. So, like, I was reading about the experiment that Syl talks about. Yeah, it's in this the Rupert Sheldrake Science Delusion book. Actually, there's a whole bit on it.
My mum got me out for Christmas.
That's I looked that book up. Very sort of provocative title, but
it's very provocative. Yeah.
The reviews I read basically said it's the materialist delusion, but done in a way that more people will buy.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Oh, well, the guy who wrote it is actually a scientist.
He went to Cambridge
and stuff. But he was saying, like, for the free will thing, for some neuroscientists and philosophers, this experiment would seem like the ultimate proof that free will is an illusion. But I think Liebert, I think was the guy who did it, the experiment, and he suggested that instead, sort of the gap within the gap between conscious awareness of the desire to act and the actual movement, there was an opportunity for the person's conscious mind to veto the decision. So it's like, instead of a free will, there's a free won't. And then he went on to kind of expanded it into this like conscious mental field idea, which emerged from brain activities but was not itself physically determined by the brain activities. And then it goes into like random things affect the nerve cells, and the field helps integrate activities of different parts of the brain and had the property of referring back subjective experiences and thus worked backwards in time. I don't know if that makes sense. But basically, he's talking about a kind of causation that works differently from the type of linear causation, which in like most of conventional science, I think.
So causal that doesn't really obey the arrows of time.
Exactly. And in other things, like, for example, economics, where when you're looking at sort of lines of causation, but actually you can't sort of, in sort of an economic system, you can't map it in a way that's completely linear and causal, because you've got like organic interdependency and feedback loops, which messes up the whole system. And a scientific way of looking at that would be like, okay, we haven't got all the initial conditions, or we haven't measured accurately enough all the initial frames that are needed to kind of accurately predict what's going to happen. Rather than saying, well, maybe science isn't the right, or maths maybe isn't the right thing to measure what's going on here. And I'm guessing that might be a similar problem when you're looking at things like free will and psychology and all of that.
Yeah.
It just hasn't got the tools to kind of explain or get to grips with it.
My only kind of question with that, though, is if it's something you can't measure and use kind of metrics to evaluate, how then do you evaluate it in any sort of agreeable or more reliable way? Or is it just kind of, we go, this seems right, let's all agree on that, we agree on that, and some people don't agree on that, and that's just their choice, and that's that, and there's no more to it? How do you come to like a conclusion? If a conclusion needs to be come to, because often it doesn't.
Individually or collectively.
Yeah. Is it just kind of arbitrary as a collective?
Good question.
Well,
yeah, you stumped us.
I don't know, because since we're talking about Rupert Sheldrake, I don't know if you guys have heard about morphogenetic fields. No?
May have. It sounds like the sort of stuff I will have heard of, but just it might be using different terminology. Morphogenetic fields. Yeah,
so this is what Rupert Sheldrake actually is one of his biggest controversial kind of experiments that he's done, I believe. I don't know if you mentioned it in his book.
Yeah, I talked about it a bit in the book.
But because he was a very big scientist at like Cambridge, was professor in biology and stuff, I believe. And then he did this experiment, which basically morphogenetic fields, as I understand them, it's been a long time since I like looked at the study, but it's going to sound very hand wavy. However, it's so I believe he did experiments with rats where he had one kind of gate which was dark and one gate which was light, and he and behind the light gateway, they would get electric. Well, they would get an electric shock, and then behind the dark gateway there would be food, or some sort of reward or treat. And at first, all the rats would go to the light gateway because that's what rats do. They see light, they go towards the light.
Yeah.
And but then I believe he bred the rats, and the next generations massively, I think significantly, actually suddenly even had these offspring of these rats had never ever kind of been in that environment before, never been in that cage before. But even from the start, some of them would go to the dark gateway, and eventually, I think most of them will go to the dark gateway without ever having been there before. Like completely unusual behavior for any of the rats. And I'm not sure if it was just a genetic offspring. It may have actually also been just any different set of rats just in that environment went to the dark gateway, because he theorized that there were these morphogenetic fields, like which gave. Yeah, I know you're looking very devious.
No, I really bought it up until just other rats in the same environment. At that point, I was like,
I was the same.
Extreme expert out.
There's a big difference.
I can answer this.
Yeah.
So largely his theory is that.
I mean, I could still buy it slightly, but at that point, it started to kind of where do we go with that?
Yeah. So I think largely his theory is that once something happens once, or happens a number of times, it somehow interacts with what he theorizes as these like morphogenetic fields, which makes it much easier for that thing to happen again. He uses this a lot in talking about random. Well, I think it's something like random transmutations of. No, that's not right. Something to do with crystals forming into different crystals, like randomly at. So a certain element would be in or certain chemical would start kind of crystallizing into something else at one point over the world, and then he would say that once it happened once, it would start happening in other places all over the world again at the same time. Well, not at the same time, but shortly after, and that these things would be connected and they'd never acted in this strange way before. And it's to do with the interference of these fields. I'm not entirely sure about the rest of it.
It's interesting. Like I bring this because, like, supposedly these morphogenetic fields are immaterial. They're not. Yeah. They're not something that can. But as you said, Rob, it's something that potentially, as he's tried to theorize, acts on the material world, which is what you were saying last time. However, it is something very immaterial, I would say.
But it was also something that's clearly affected. Well, it might not be clearly affected by I suppose it might not be clearly affected by the material world. But he's saying it becomes more likely almost because one has gone this way, rather than there's just morphogenetic field arrives and it's suddenly more likely all over the world for these things to go that way. And it just happens to be that he's observing the first one and saying it's because of that. It could just, I mean, it could well be that the morphogenetic predates the first one, right?
I'm not entirely sure. I think it's more how.
That's not what he's theorizing, supposedly.
You can see the progression though, still, even if it's not the first one.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, I haven't read the papers. If there are papers, I haven't read the science. From the science I have read, obviously that has not been said to me. So currently, there is reasonable doubt and quite a lot of it. But you know, certainly the stuff I could definitely. I mean, there's loads of stuff in kind of like genetics and epigenetics where if you're being selected on hard by a certain thing, I'm going to relate this back to being morphogenetic field still before I give everyone a genetic lesson. You can be kind of selected on by one particular thing and it not be something you're particularly predisposed to have genetic change to, but selection can actually increase the susceptibility of can cause an increase in the susceptibility of your DNA to mutate, to change towards it, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So certain areas of your DNA are more likely to mutate than others. And if you're getting one particular gene that's not being exposed that much to mutation, random mutation, and then that gene starts getting selected on hard by nature, then that gene could, it much faster over time suddenly become much more susceptible, typically by kind of biochemical means, as that's how these things are tested, to kind of being more susceptible to genetic change. So I could certainly, that's why I immediately sort of could buy the first part. And what I'd be interested in is basically how he manages to test these morphogenetic fields. Because if there's been a lot of skepticism around it, it's probably because he can't test it. But also, he's also trying to sort of, when he's saying it's immaterial, when it doesn't sound like his theory is that non-causal, it would, or it's got feedback causality. It's sort of, it almost sounds a bit like he's trying to say it's immaterial as a kind of escape route for having to prove it. Would be the way I think plenty of scientists might look at it.
I think I agree with Rob. I think the problem with this sort of idea is that the way that science works is that when you come up with something new, it has to fit with sort of previously set ideas. And it's got to be the case that the explanation given by Sheldrake is the most simplest and the sort of most likely explanation. I'm not sure if that would be the case. There's a lot this happens a lot in psychology. There's a lot of sort of parapsychology where people seem to think they've got evidence of stuff like precognition, like reacting, like reverse of time, sort of not like activation before consciousness, but like actual people will be able to predict the future.
When you say simplest explanation, do you mean simplest explanation given the evidence of that experiment, or simplest explanation given the evidence before you did the experiment?
Both. Obviously when you refer to an experiment, you want the simplest explanation that explains that evidence, but you base that explanation on all the evidence that's come before it. And so a lot of this parapsychology, there's always better, less interesting, a bit more boring, but better explanations basically. So the studies on precognition, this sort of predicting the future, is much better explained by people doing bad statistics and bad experimental practice. Which is not what you want, but that happens a lot of the time. So I think the whole way that science works is that you got to be able to put things in existing frameworks, and you got to be able to say that this is the only true explanation. And that's why science is so great. That whilst there are issues with it, what science is really good at is narrowing down possibilities. We might not be good at, scientists might not be good at saying we're definitely sure that it's this, but scientists are good at basically being Sherlock Holmes and saying, well, we're sure it's not that, but it could be one of these things. So that's what science does well, at least.
Keep itself open to change if things do have to fit into the existing frameworks.
But you can still existing framework, right? You can still to have it not fit into the existing framework, you'd have to test the existing framework and prove it to not be true, right? If you want to challenge it, you can't. You have to kind of come up with an actual counterpoint.
So you can change frameworks. This is a guy called Thomas Kuhn. He sort of came up with this idea of research paradigms, which are basically whole frameworks that scientists work in. Something like evolutionary biology is a great example of research paradigm, in that all of your research is based. Let's go with Rob. Rob is a classic evolutionary biologist. The research and the studying that he's done is based on sort of the foundations from Darwin onwards, and that he thinks about that, and he works to confirm that, and that's what Rob did at undergraduate level. But if something else came along and said evolution is wrong, that would be a change of framework, sort of a paradigm shift, as they say. But to do that, you need extraordinary evidence, and you need really good reasons to do that.
I think what Emma potentially means was some way do we think that science, in the face of extraordinary evidence, would even identify it as extraordinary evidence, not just skate over it? Because
it doesn't. Sometimes science messes up.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes, like, a good example is tectonic plates. Like, we all know that tectonic plates exist. Sort of in the ocean, there's, well, whatever. I don't do earth sciences. Don't want to get that subject, but yeah, we know there's continents, and there's like plates underneath, and they move, and that's why you get mountains and volcanoes.
Yeah.
But this idea came up. So someone came up with it sort of 40, 50 years before it was actually accepted.
Wagner.
Yeah, so something like that happens.
Strong knowledge.
Alfred Wagner, you are a silly man.
I said strong knowledge. It's not that strong.
Sorry, Max, carry on.
Yeah, no, I think that's. I mean, Mendel's another good example. Rob will know all about Mendel and his peas, and he came up with sort of the ideas of genes and stuff. People don't really think about that. They sort of rediscovered it 50, 60 years after he actually did it.
Yeah.
So
science
doesn't always work.
That's a really good example. So yeah, they come up with all these different ideas after Darwin of how the sort of Darwin had come up with this process of things changing over time depending on what nature selected them to be most fit. But we didn't know how the process was passed on over time. Mendel did this lovely experiment and got all these this wonderful evidence with some peas that you may have learned about at UCC biology. Yellow peas and shriveled peas and green peas and round peas. And people didn't notice it for, a few decades. And they all came up with their own ideas and tried to form their own evidence. And then someone came along and said, hold on, there's this monk, Gregor, and he's done all these peas and they're right and you're wrong. And eventually they kind of changed their mind. So I think there's definitely evidence that science can change in the face of what it considers extraordinary evidence. But I think the real debate here is what counts as extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
Because obviously there is stuff that science, and it's the same with Einstein's theories of laws of physics and relativity, general relativity, special relativity, which has changed our understandings of that, and clearly clearly we can change our views, but it's obviously like a kind of a bit of a paradox that it's up to science to decide what science deems extraordinary evidence, rather than sort of a more unbiased body.
Yeah. What does Einstein say at some point? It's like asking a tribe you believe in the dream people to.
It's like it's a really great quote actually. Hang on.
Yeah.
It's like asking. Hang on. I will.
You can always cut. Like.
I will find this, but I thought it was. Oh yeah. Okay. The scientific method relies for its own supercultural validity on principles that aren't themselves among its own assumptions. The logic of its justification is circular. A parallel would be an aborigine insisting, okay, let's settle this question of whether scientific experiment or dreaming is the way to true knowledge once and for all. Let's settle it by entering the dream time and asking the ancestors.
Yeah.
So, I thought that was quite
it is true that there's this whole idea of I think it's fair to talk about science as it comes up with scientific knowledge. It doesn't come up with facts, and scientific knowledge isn't objective reality. But the question is why is so you touched on this last week, but it's called the demarcation problem. Like why is science different? What makes science a privileged or sort of different form of knowledge? And that's a really good question that people don't really have an answer to now as well.
People don't.
But you can treat science like you treat Aborigines. Like as a sort of sociologist, you can look at as scientists as part of a sort of collective, as part of a sort of social structure that develops knowledge as a consequence of that. Just as the same way you can look at why do sort of Aborigines or sort of anyone, why does anyone believe what they believe? It's because of the social sort of forces that drive that. And science is exactly the same. But whether there's anything different about it, that's yeah, I know there are some reasons, but it's not quite immediately obvious.
Yeah, we tried to, I guess, outline those with the assumptions last week. But
yes, yeah, exactly.
Mikey, you wanted to have a go at that randomness of kind of nuclear decay and whether that's random or not.
Can we link that into free will as well, maybe, Mikey?
No. Yeah, I haven't jumped in on this because this has been not really my field. But I didn't manage to watch the entirety of the last podcast, so I missed the bit on random decay. So what were you saying about that? If you could just fill me in.
I think I was not really focusing last time. I think I just mentioned random nuclear decay at one point.
Basically,
I said it was.
I was saying there's some non-causal stuff in the universe. For example, random decay. And Sil was just like, don't think it's random, think you're wrong. Didn't really have much to say to that.
You think it's pseudo random and not completely random, and yeah.
But there are things that we know are pseudo random because we've made them, and there are tests for pseudo randomness, for instance, and every single test of radioactive decay has passed for true randomness. Like, given, we have presumably millions or billions of samples of radioactive decay that we've measured, and using all of that, everyone who's tried has never been able to find an algorithm or a set of rules to predict the next radioactive decay better than just pure randomness.
But that could just be that our computing power is limiting, right?
Yeah, it could just be that there's a super, super complex way in that it's generated. But doesn't it seem a lot more likely that it is just random?
Yeah, potentially.
I buy you, but again, that's another case of me thinking rather than believing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, it's not proof. I mean, you can't really prove things with statistics. You could just say we, give some confidence interval.
Yeah.
But also, how does
maybe
it into free will potentially? Because if I'm just extrapolating here potentially wrongly, but I'm just thinking if we are saying nuclear decay is random, right? That means that nothing in this universe could be fixed or predicted.
It's non-deterministic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you believe that there is such thing as free will?
Well, it's whether that leads to free will or not. I mean,
because I don't think that does. I think that leads to unpredictable outcomes, but it's still outcomes that aren't chosen by the free individual. They're still just basically random outcomes acting on probabilities. Free will still needs to be like causal, but non-predictable. If you see what I mean?
It's like whether would you say a dice has free will because it can be any number from 1 to 6. You'd more say it's just a random, assuming rolling a dice is random. You wouldn't say the dice has free will necessarily.
Scary thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only way you could really properly believe in free will is if you believe there's some. I think you might have touched on this last time, but like something almost outside the universe, something, some sort of
immaterial.
Yeah, immaterial. That's the word.
Yeah,
something like that. Because just looking at the universe that we know, it seems. I don't see how you could really arrive at free will.
But that's because we look at it in a way that doesn't, like, there's no logical way you could have free will, and we are only looking at a logical material universe. So of course, if it exists, it doesn't exist within science's framework. It's something.
No, they could, because you could imagine for there to be free will, there'd have to be some immaterial thing, but presumably that acts on our universe.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be something we'd ever be able to know, right? It'd be something we'd be able to know of, but never be able to understand.
Well, it should be something
you wouldn't be able to
measure it. You should be able to measure it. If it can affect our brains by definition.
But if you can know what's going to come, then it's not free will, is it?
No. I'm not saying you know what's going to come, but presumably, it communicates through some medium by, increasing voltages or something. So
you'd be able to know, you'd be able to know of it, but you just wouldn't be able to know it.
You wouldn't know the process by which it works, but you should be able to detect some.
Yeah.
And I guess, and maybe that could be randomness. It could be that's how free will operates on our world, perhaps.
And maybe it's in the brain, and we don't know the brain yet, and therefore the jury's still out.
Rob, you say there's no logical way we think free will exists. Could you expand?
No, not that. But there's no way we could understand free will, like how free will works, using logic. I think, or at least using causal logic.
But so explain how causal logic states there's no free will.
So the fundamentals of causal logic is that there's cause and effect, and that the effects are caused by, the effects are caused by previous things, right?
Yeah.
And free will is you kind of, I guess, would be you have a bunch of inputs and then you make a decision based on those inputs, right? That's fundamentally what free will is the basically ability for an individual thing, or I guess a thing to make a decision, right?
I'm not sure that is
of its own volition.
It's because a computer will get inputs and make a decision,
but not of its own volition. That
that's the key phrase, I think, is of its
own volition. As in,
how do you define that?
Well, it's something that can't. Basically, I would say free will is something that can't be predicted. A causal decision that can't be predicted. But obviously, and our current understanding of causal logic is if you can understand the effect, then you can kind of test that and understand the cause, and then you can understand. Then you'd be able to understand it. So, as I understand it, causal logic would never be able to work out the mechanism of free will, because free will would be non-logical causality.
I think there's a difference between prediction and determinism. So I think you can have a deterministic system which is entirely unpredictable.
That's what we
which
think
is fine which I think a lot of people, philosophers, subscribe to determinism more or less, or to physicalism at least, that physical world, everything within the world is caused by something happening in the world. But in terms of free will, is that it doesn't mean it's predictable, that you can't predict what someone's going to do because of the complexity, as sort of Emma's mentioned before. Like, the world is so complex, everything's so hard to determine that that we're not able to basically complexity, logic and stuff, that you can't actually predict what's going to happen.
But my point is more that if free will was kind of caused by a bunch of inputs which then run on a total kind of physical cause and effect system, then provided we were capable of it, or theoretically it might be possible to kind of predict what happens, or at least it would be deterministic. And I think free will would be non-deterministic causality, effectively.
So I think there's two ways I could interpret what you're saying by non-deterministic causality. Is it either that it's so almost infinitely complex that you could never determine it, or is it because there's randomness in it?
I would say it would. But then you're trying to work out with logic there, and I would say it's inherently illogical. I would say it's neither of those things.
I know, what's happened?
Well, because that's why I think it would be immaterial, right?
I mean, I
This is partially why I believe in free will, but but if it doesn't exist, then we haven't disproved it yet.
So you're saying it's deterministic, but if it's by
no,
by
it would
definition,
have to be non-causal but non-deterministic, like totally causal but non-deterministic.
So what do you mean by that? So different. So giving the same input to this system on multiple occasions, giving the exact same input, it would produce different results based on the same input.
It could produce different results.
You mean
okay?
Like Young's double slit?
I have no idea what you just said, Sil.
You said Young's double slit experiment.
Young's double slit.
It's tangentially.
Observer effect.
Yeah. But again, is that random? Because this is the thing: is I'm not saying free will is random. I'm saying it could produce different outcomes, but like it doesn't because a decision is made.
See, it sounds like what you're saying is it's deterministic, but you don't want to say it's deterministic.
Well, no, but that's the thing. Is I think it's. I don't think free will exists, right? But I'm trying to work out how it could exist, and if it would, like, because you'd be making a decision.
Yes.
That's sort of the premise of it, right? Is you are making a decision when you could make something else. You could make another decision.
Yeah.
Right. Another decision is like possible for you to make, and yet you make the decisions you do make.
But why do you make that decision? That's the question, and that's another set of inputs, surely.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. But if you have just a bunch of inputs, then you don't have free will, do you?
Well, yeah.
We're trying to work out how free will could exist, not why it doesn't.
I don't even know. Well, I think, yeah, it's quite an elusive concept. And I don't think, really, when you study sort of the brain and psychology, it's come up a bit. I'm trying to remember. But I feel it doesn't quite make sense as a concept when you analyze it, sort of outside of. So free will obviously originated quite
because it's a lot.
This is quite a theological, theological concept. But as a concept in sort of modern philosophy and psychology, it's not. It's more, well, we sort of like things happen in the brain that mean we do things. And people accept that physical things happen in the brain, which means we do physical things. And it's not the case that there's anything else necessarily going on. There might be things we can't explain with sort of just physical processes, and some people believe that. But the cause is quite a dodgy term in science. Like, what is a cause? That's a whole other can of worms. But I think free will as a concept is not necessarily sort of quite useful. Like, I'm sure everyone here feels like they have free will. Even you, Rob. Surely you don't feel like some sort of robot. Like,
well, that's
like
the thing. I have quite a lot of cognitive dissonance with this, because I want to say, like, it's kind of hard to believe free will, but at the same time, it's a bit like what I said last time with the kind of moral assumptions. I sort of feel like I have to assume it, because if I don't assume free will, then none of my decisions have any real value or consequence, because they're not mine. They're always going to be made.
Well, they are your decisions, but they're just, your decisions are based on what's happening. Basically, there's not something else going on. It is inputs and outputs.
How could you punish someone for just the set of inputs and outputs they had no control over? And how could you say someone's done well if they've just had a bunch of inputs and outputs and they were always going to do well?
But I think it's a really good
nothing
point,
matters.
because it relates to the idea that I think free will is only possible with the idea of like a separate self, which is definitely kind of integral to the sort of scientific way of looking at things.
What do you mean a separate self?
A separate self.
Surely any self or anything would. You've lost me there.
So as in, I don't quite know what I think about free will, but I was having this thought now in a separate self, in the idea that you are an autonomous being separate from the rest of the world, and that you kind of have a sort of an ego attached to that.
Yeah, there is quite there is a movement in sort of philosophy of mind. It goes back to Descartes, the sort of idea of dualism, that you have sort of, there's the physical world, and then there's the mental world, and there's separate things. And basically there's something going on between the physical world and the mental world that transforms inputs into sort of mental concepts, and they're sort of physically separate. That sort of fell out of favor in, again, the 20th century. That sort of got sort of pulled apart a bit. But we're almost sort of in philosophy of mind, and especially to the consciousness, we're sort of almost coming back to that. In that, so consciousness is quite a horrible subject when you get into it. It's very confusing. It's not a nice thing to think about. But basically, what's happened is, like, when you try and let's say you come up with like, you find in the brain sort of like a particular set of neurons or a particular pattern of firing, that is consciousness. That's like the physical embodiment of consciousness, like, hypothetically. You can do that, and that's fine. But still, what is consciousness? Like, it doesn't answer the question of, like, what actually consciousness is. You can say, oh, it's just these neurons, but is that enough? And yeah, and that doesn't say, like, what is conscious like. It just says it's this thing. It's just this, like, physical pattern. Yeah, so it's called, like, the hard problem of consciousness, that you can go as far as finding, like, what actually consciousness looks like in the brain, but that doesn't answer all the questions about consciousness that there are. And there's this whole world of sort of pan-psychism and sort of, yeah, everything to do with that, where everything's conscious. Consciousness is like an irreducible property of the universe and stuff like that. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah. So we're almost coming back to dualism. I rattled through a lot of stuff there, but yeah, but as a whistle-stop tour.
Which one do you ascribe to, Max? Currently.
So, I think there is a point where, so basically, I think consciousness is an emergent property of certain systems. But as to what that sort of system is, there's some really good ideas. There's some interesting ideas. There's one called, what's it called? Information integration theory, where basically consciousness is a general property of systems that basically integrate information. And there is a sort of mathematical definition of that, which is quite interesting. It's quite a useful way of thinking about things. So basically it means that obviously we're, like, really good at, we completely integrate lots of information because we've got brains, they're massive processors. So we have a lot of consciousness. So there's levels of theta, and it's not very set, but it's interesting. But then you come to dogs, and dogs don't do as much like sort of integrating information. So dogs are slightly less conscious. And then you come to sort of phones, and phones do a bit, but not much. They've got a little bit of consciousness. It's an interesting way of thinking about things. It's not really set as a subject.
What happens if you break it down to the actual systems of singular fundamental particles? Is that?
So I don't think there's not like one thing. I think a lot of people are fairly confident that it's sort of to do with systems rather than things, if that makes sense.
I like
sort of
the
networks.
systems idea. That vibes a lot with my evolutionary background.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it works. It sounds.
I would have previously thought it to be before I went down and opened this can of worms.
Which is quite an interesting way of thinking about things. Because systems are. Yeah, there's a lot of people. There's some people who write some interesting stuff about sort of how. Yeah, sort of how, like, emergent properties of systems can, like, explain a lot of things. But there's people who don't believe that at all. People like consciousness isn't really a thing. Like we discussed, like with the whole premotor area, like how much of our thinking is actually like conscious? It's not actually very much. And a lot of our sort of thinking and what we think, what we feel and what we're thinking isn't actually like that much. Like we're basically robots, and we have a little bit of, we have some sort of ability to sort of like almost observe or like represent our like what's going on, which comes back to your free will. Actually, a lot of people like you can go the sort of consciousness as a general property of the universe sort of idea, or you can go the completely other way. Consciousness isn't really a thing. It's probably where Rob's getting close to, and it does come down to free will a bit. It's not.
No, I think
there are people who think, oh, we're
really
just robots.
think we're conscious.
Yeah, like we are conscious, but consciousness actually is it a special thing? Some people don't think it's special at all. Some people think it's really special. That's a big divide. Philosophy of mind is like, is consciousness, is it like, yeah, what is consciousness? Is it interesting? Maybe not.
Special.
But it is obviously we're conscious though. Obviously we have thoughts and feelings and stuff, and we're all fairly sort of, maybe apart from Rob, we all no, obviously Rob does, but he doesn't think he does.
Yeah, I do. I don't think I make any decisions. I think I have thoughts and feelings. I just don't know whether the thoughts are mine. I think the feelings are pretty clearly mine.
I would say
feelings don't need to be free to have value.
Doesn't it completely depend on how you choose to interpret like what our thoughts are, kind of like how that's almost encoded? Because you could say that, I don't know, for instance, a rock is conscious because, you know, just like we do, it takes an input, you know, like you can shine a light on it like you can to us, and, you know, maybe a few of the atoms in the rock will heat up and maybe a little pebble or something will fall off the rock. And to us, that doesn't seem like it's really thought or anything, but that's just because of how we choose to think about thoughts. You know, we're saying, well, that's obviously not, you know, a complex thought. Whereas when we see a light and then, you know, it goes through millions of neurons, and then our output is through speaking or moving or something like that. That's consciousness.
I think I'm going to stick.
It's just entirely arbitrary.
I think I'm going to stick with the information integration complexity of thought systems crap.
No, I don't think it is entirely arbitrary. I think the logical extension of consciousness as an emergent property of systems, or the idea that systems do have emergent properties, if you extend that down to a rock, say, it is going to have some level of consciousness, and that's exactly how.
But what if there's a cutoff point?
But
yeah, well, this is the thing. Like,
this
is what some people believe, is that consciousness is it's called panpsychism, that consciousness is everywhere and everything has some little level of consciousness. Like, obviously we're quite high up on the list.
They don't believe there could be a cutoff point. They've negated that.
Yeah, but obviously some people think there's some very good reasons why there might be a cutoff point and why that's actually not a very good idea. Like, it's like computers are really good. Computers are a really interesting thing to think about. As Mikey will attest, the computers are interesting. But like, are computers conscious? Like, there's some really good arguments to say that computers, it's the difference between syntax and semantics. So like, syntax, you can have a set of rules which a computer can process, but does the computer actually understand like the semantics of what it's doing? So like sentences, we have rules for forming sentences so you can understand me. So you know the rules, but you're able to understand the meaning as well as the rules. Or are computers only able to understand the rules, and like, does that apply to other sort of systems, sort of thing? So people, like lots of people think there is a cutoff. So yeah, exactly. There's a lot going on basically, which we're not very sure about. Yeah. But it's interesting. It's cool stuff.
Yeah, I remember.
Just to have a comment on Rob's and whilst Mikey thinks, going back to like Mike's point about arbitrary as well, then, because if you are saying a rock, if you shine a light on it and it loses a pebble, and we obviously don't view that as the same level of consciousness, but it is a system that has an output. And Rob was like, oh yeah, no, but it's like computers are more conscious than a rock. Why are we deciding that our like
we are, I am
a light and like us saying words because of it is a greater level of consciousness, because who's to say that a rock heating up those few atoms is any less consciousness? It's an arbitrary scale at that point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Human defined, yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I guess this is kind of segued out of the scientific method now, but I could definitely go into what I would consider like cutoffs or like levels of consciousness with regards to kind of a theory of mind, being self-aware, having emotion.
That you would. Why does that matter?
Oh yeah, no, I don't think. But I think the whole point of this discussion is that there's no kind of one. Where do we agree? There's just what I think is valuable, and the reasons I think is valuable are kind of long time spent kind of looking at evolutionary biology and forming my own opinions. And I'm not sure I'm going to particularly be that successful in. I mean, I can try, but I'm not sure I'll be that successful in convincing some of the other people here of why I'm right and everything else is wrong.
Doesn't that seem like some?
I think I'm right and everything else is wrong.
That doesn't sound like some intrinsic part of the universe. That sounds like something you've decided.
Yeah.
It's something I think is a part of the universe, but the reason I think it is, I don't really know if I could describe that in a way that other people here would necessarily agree with. And the reason I say that is I know I've tried to virtually all of you, and I'm not sure any of you agree with me. So,
in another way of thinking about it, in terms of like where to draw the line, be something along the lines of self-organizing systems, because something like, but then I guess it then becomes a line of where you draw the line of scale, because you could argue that like an atom is a self-organizing system, but you could also argue that like a forest is a self-organizing system, whereas you could potentially argue that a rock is simply a collection of things that have forces acting upon them, and a machine is simply a collection of bits that have forces acting upon them, which makes them do something. Maybe it becomes arbitrary again.
So, yeah, this is the thing is, if that is the case, and you have like a panpsychism universe, because the whole universe would then be a kind of self-organizing system.
Exactly.
Then the whole universe has equal meaning, and therefore is equally meaningless.
This is another.
And so therefore I don't really care about the rest, and I only care about myself, and we're back at square one.
Yeah, I think.
No,
you go for it, Emma. Go for it.
Okay. But actually, that only if you understand yourself as kind of as a separate self to the rest of the universe, then you only care about you. But if you understand yourself as part of the universe, then obviously you have to, like, what you do to the universe, you do to yourself, and vice versa. They are the same.
Yeah. The only thing I will say to that is one thing I kind of think I firmly believe, that I think is relatively easy to explain, is that there's definitely levels of my consciousness. There are self-organized thinking systems, self-organizing systems, complex information integration systems that I have that I don't share with other people. Otherwise, we'd all have the same thoughts. So, like, on some level, I fully think that we are integrated. And I completely buy that. I think it, obviously, I think we live in a shared reality, and therefore, part of that, we probably are part of that reality, and there's going to be some sort of link there, some sort of, integration. But there's also definitely an element of us being not identical, not literally the same. We are, we do think different things. And so I don't know exactly where to draw the line or how much the lines are exactly worth. But
I mean,
Yeah,
the universe is like a complex system. Actually, I don't know. Could it be that, say, we're all akin to like fingers on your hand of the body in terms of like different parts of the universe? Something, I don't know. Is there a brain? Does it come to that question?
It's a dangerous. Go for it, Zoe. Go for it.
I just slightly confused because if we're all sort of interconnected in a network, and surely then how can we say there's free will if the choices we make and the choices others make are also interconnected? Like, how can you hold people responsible for your own actions if everything is being influenced by inputs all the time? I don't think you can, unfortunately. Yeah, I think the general consensus here is, well, maybe that's not quite true, but I think there's probably a depressingly large consensus, if we want to call it depressing, because I guess it would really be, something we can actually feel, would be that there isn't free will.
Well, maybe not in the way that we understand.
Yeah.
To be. But Max, you were going to say something.
I think everyone's picked up on this idea of panpsychism, which is really it is interesting. But you can sort of see how sort of like, I'm not sure, it's sort of profound, sort of dangerous. Like suddenly everything can be conscious, can't it? Like any system, two people talking to each other, is there some sort of higher level of consciousness where these two systems are interacting? It's like and stuff like this, all like planets and like these are all systems, and there was all information and stuff. So it's like, so it's quite a dangerous idea. I'm not sure if I'm definitely not 100% set on it. I think that's the whole point. That's why it's so interesting, the sort of philosophy of science, philosophy of mind.
It's also
so much of it isn't set, so it's very easy to open to interpretation.
It then just becomes a definition thing, right? What you define consciousness as. I think that's the heart of the matter. Like, how do you define consciousness? And that's the question you're trying to answer. And you need a scientific definition of consciousness, which we don't necessarily have. I like because for me the panpsychism thing just basically relegates consciousness to being a sort of interesting but ultimately meaningless word.
Yeah, it is a bit of a cop-out because it's sort of saying consciousness is this sort of fundamental property. We can't really think about it any more than that.
Yeah.
Which I'm not sure about.
I don't know why that means it's meaningless though.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it doesn't have explanatory value.
What was that, Mikey? Sorry?
If everyone's super, no one is.
Yeah. That's what you said. I was like, no.
But yeah, I think and there doesn't seem to be a nice clean one, because you could say that, going down to like the smallest fundamental particles, they form some sort of system that reacts to things, and up to, galaxies form a sort of system. So it's kind of like everything can be conscious if you want it to. So I kind of either I would say everything is conscious, but that then consciousness kind of loses its meaning, or what I would more be inclined to believe is that nothing is conscious.
But surely it only loses its meaning if you believe consciousness is what gives life meaning.
As in if everything's conscious, then saying that this thing is conscious doesn't really have any meaning because it's implicit.
I guess so. Yeah.
Did you say everything's conscious or nothing's conscious?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's almost like just an arbitrary definition. It doesn't seem to be any, like law of the universe or something to do.
It's because we don't have a scientific definition. That is like the problem. Is it is an arbitrary definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a potentially non-useful definition.
But how can it be useful if it's arbitrary at the moment? Like, if multiple people have different ones, it's not a very useful word.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean, is in there hasn't been any useful definition that's come up.
Although, is it useful? Because if you believe a tree is conscious, you're not going to chop it down.
Yeah, like, or I think it's more that we've got to the point where, so science can't define it, therefore it's arbitrary, therefore it doesn't matter. And I think that's the fundamental problem with science.
One of the word.
Well.
No, whoa.
I would.
Because science hasn't got
that's
it
a
yet
job
doesn't
for
mean
us.
it won't.
Strong
We're still
angry
working on it.
noises from lots of people.
And also to reply to what Sil said, if we think a tree is conscious, therefore you shouldn't cut it down. A cut down tree is also still conscious, so it's fine. End of the day. If you say everything's conscious, you can just kill someone because a dead body's conscious.
But then that says that all consciousness is the same, or it kind of paints everything exactly the same and not.
Yes. But the point is there's different definitions for consciousness. Is the fact that the word in our language is basically a bit useless, rather than that, things feeling things or things being able to make decisions or, things being self-aware is useless. It's just, where do we draw the line? What does it mean? It's kind of a bit of a wish-wash word. Whereas, I would say that something being self-aware, potentially in my mind, has some value. Whether that gives it value as something I want to value over something else, or whether that's, more like that's something that can then, make decisions. That's probably more theory. Yeah, if it's something that can then make decisions or has, is aware of the decisions being made, then do you start ascribing kind of punishment and reward, guilt, things like that? And if you can ascribe that to it, then there's kind of, is there intrinsic meaning there? And if there's emotion, does that confer intrinsic meaning? Whereas consciousness is kind of, at some point it's a mix of those. At some point it might not be a mix of any of those. It might be predating all of those. But it's sort of, whether consciousness matters depends very much on what the word means, rather than it's a word that's kind of, I don't even know how many, it's 8, 9 letters long, therefore it matters. Why?
But going back to Emma's point, do you guys think that just because science doesn't have a definition for it, making it arbitrary and therefore it doesn't matter, is that a problem? Or yeah.
Well, I think any word that doesn't have a definition is pretty meaningless, right?
We're talking about a fundamental property, though, if you're viewing it as such.
Oh, if it's a fundamental property, well then.
If there's nothing useful we can say about it, then I would. I mean, this is not necessarily from a scientific point of view. I'm just saying, if there is nothing useful or meaningful we can say about this concept, then I would say,
in a scientific way.
But that you mean so we can't observe anything interesting about it.
I'm very confused about your ascribation of science to simply a word that I don't think has a definition. Why is that? You've lost me here. I don't know how science is related to that.
So we're talking about if consciousness. We're talking about panpsychism, that the belief that consciousness is intrinsic to the universe, basically.
Yeah.
And science, I think we've established that science cannot measure that, or cannot. It's the scientific method cannot kind of give that any value, because it doesn't exist within its assumptions, really.
What I say is not the scientific method.
You can't measure it.
I don't think.
But so I think what Emma's point was that because we can't measure it, and using this scientific method, if we, as I think a lot of people do in this world, think science is, the good method and best method, it means that we don't view this as important. Whereas someone not using the scientific method, it could still be really important.
But I think it goes even further than that. Even the fact that we're sat here saying, does consciousness matter? A part of me is like, well, of course it does. Look at us.
We don't know what it means. What does it mean?
We're just robots chatting to each other.
But what does consciousness mean?
How can it
matter? The fact that we can even get to a point, that idea, to me, it feels like we've become so abstracted from what it is to exist and be alive.
But how? I don't understand how we can ascribe anything what basically until I know what consciousness means, I can't.
Well, I think the problem isn't. I think we do know what. It's not a question of meaning. It's a question of. It's not what does consciousness mean. It's what is consciousness like. So we have an idea of what consciousness is. So this idea that there's, it's this sort of feeling of subjectivity and sort of self-reference that we're able to form sort of representation of representation is how they sort of define it. That we're able to we're subjective and aware of our existence, basically. Is Descartes, I think, therefore I am.
That's the definition of consciousness then? Well,
it's not the definition of consciousness, but that's part of it. It's sort of, it is an elusive concept, but we're aware, and we're aware of that we're sort of aware, basically. We're able to tell that we're able to sort of think about things and have a subjective mental states, basically, which represent what we can see and what we can perceive. So we are aware of what it means to be conscious. But the problem is, one, how can we tell if so Rob, you're aware that you're conscious, but you can't, how can we tell that other people are
conscious?
How can we tell what other things are conscious?
Well, like it's something zombies, isn't it? It's like thought zombies or consciousness zombies. Or
yeah, exactly. So everyone else can be zombies, and this is the problem with other minds. So we can't directly observe other people's thoughts. So we are aware that we're conscious and aware that people behave like they're conscious. But what
I might just be the player character, and the rest of you are NPCs.
Yeah, exactly. Like that is basically it. Like, but the question is, why? The question is, how can we definitively tell when something is conscious? So to do that, we need an idea of what consciousness is like, which we don't have yet. But that's fine. We're allowed to. Like, the thing with science is it doesn't have to know everything. Scientific knowledge doesn't have to cover all of sort of what we know exists, basically. But the whole point of the scientific, so I don't like the word scientific method or the phrase scientific method, because it's sort of just like what Rob does, what Sil does, or what I do. I'm sort of a scientist. I'll claim scientist. It's very different. So the idea of a scientific method isn't very useful, but the idea of science itself can go forward, and it's able to explore and come to a solution to these problems, but it might take a while. So yeah, I'm very much in the pro-science camp.
Yeah, so if you define consciousness as that, then obviously I think it has meaning. But I just didn't understand how we could define it if we didn't have like a set agreed upon meaning for a word. How anything like fefe could mean multiple different things to multiple different people. It's just, I have no idea as the sort of unintrinsic. But if it is that, an awareness of being aware, then
that's a pretty
obviously. Well, yeah, intrinsically that then has meaning, but meaning only has. You can only do things based upon kind of relative meaning, right? If everything was all equal in its meaning, then nothing is more meaningful than something else, and therefore all your decisions have equal outcome, right? So with panpsychism, you'd still have to have things that are more, providing consciousness is the only thing that provides value, which I would sort of disagree with myself, but if it was, then you'd have to have certain things that are more conscious than others.
Yeah, I think
to favor those.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing with panpsychism is, I think it does accept that some things are more conscious than others.
Yeah.
But that's the whole point. We don't know. The whole point we're having this chat is we don't know how to describe these sort of. We know what consciousness is, but we don't understand the science behind it, basically, or what causes. I don't like that word, but what causes consciousness to happen, and what general properties of consciousness are there, basically, and how we can fit those to other things.
Yeah, see that's where I think there are evolutionary science definitions for the properties of consciousness, which are sort of the ones that make sense in my head with regards.
Well, I think evolution plays a part in it, and looking at, there's a lot of interesting work on other animals, basically. looking, are other animals conscious? Yeah,
What's
and
the-
obviously evolution, like this sort of ecological evolutionary way of looking at it is very useful. And obviously it applies to us as well.
Yeah.
But Mikey, do you think computers could be or are conscious?
Yes. Well, if you say that a person is conscious, then, and by definition, a computer can perfectly simulate a human brain, then yeah, it must be. I mean, if you make that assumption, they can perfectly simulate a human brain, which I think it can, then yeah, I would say it is.
I think that's a fairly large assumption.
Yeah, well, it is. Well, as in the only thing in a human brain, I think that computers today couldn't necessarily simulate is actual randomness.
Well, this is what I was going to say. If you believe that there's actual randomness, how could you ever believe something could model something perfectly?
Well, you model the randomness. So, you know, we can model.
But it would be different.
Flip. Yeah. So I'm not saying it would always produce the same. It would produce the same distribution of outputs.
But you could never. Each moment, every moment, your brain is different, right?
Yes.
And if there's an infinite amount of, as in, if randomness supposedly there's an infinite amount of outcomes, right?
That's a different concept. That's the difference. So you can have, for instance, a dice.
You
there's only
believe
6 possible
deterministic,
outcomes.
but finite. No, sorry, non-deterministic but finite.
So I guess it relies on that, non-deterministic but finite. So we can perfectly represent the brain in a finite amount of data, but you know, running the algorithm of the brain will not necessarily always produce the same result because of inherent randomness in the universe.
Therefore, you couldn't simulate the brain, surely, because the simulation would be.
You couldn't predict it, but you could simulate it.
As in, you know, it's the same as simulating a coin flip or a dice. It will produce the same. If you ran it 1,000,000 times, it will produce the same distribution of outputs.
Not exactly, though, surely.
Well, if you simulated it an infinite amount of times, it would.
Yeah, but
you have the law of large numbers. What? I mean, that's the best you can do. I mean, okay. I mean, surely if we're saying that.
The fact that you have to run it an infinite amount of times to get something exact means it can never be exact.
No. So, okay, let's say we simulate a brain with the exact same brain. It would be the exact same. You'd have to run it an infinite amount of times for them to converge to the same distribution, just because they're inherently random.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
surely that means that you can never simulate to the exact same.
So okay, so the point, I feel like I'm getting hung up on something here, which I don't know. I wouldn't consider the main point. So it's like, let's say we simulate a coin flip with a computer with, you know, some system that randomly generates heads or tails. Mm-hmm. If we just ran them both 1,000 times, we might get slightly different numbers of heads and tails. You know, one might make 490 heads and 510 tails, and the other one some slightly different number.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that we're not simulating the system perfectly. And I'm just saying it would only be by definition they're the same, because if you were to simulate them infinite amount of times.
Yeah, no, I get you mean
same distribution.
But something like a coin flip is a very discrete output.
It is discrete. Yes, that's the
Whereas
discrete
brain, I don't think is.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying I think that essentially the universe is discrete.
Yeah, and I think that's where we differ.
Well, I mean, there's not, you know, they found, you know, there's like the Planck length and the Planck time, which are, you know, as far as we know, nothing relevant can happen.
Yeah.
In this, you know, this infinitesimally small almost in piece of time, but not infinitesimally small. It is finite. Crucial. Yeah. So it's like, I think maybe because I do computer science, I'm more inclined to believe that things are simulation, but it fits very nicely into that.
It's interesting. So you're basically saying you could never, you could simulate a brain, but you could never get my exact brain.
So what I'm saying is you can't think of, basically we can't brain as something that given an output always produces given an input always produces a certain output. You say given an input it produces a distribution of outputs randomly, and we can perfectly simulate this distribution. Yeah. And yeah, I believe we could do that.
And so therefore it could be conscious because it could be the exact same as a brain.
I mean, yeah, because it produces the same set of outputs. So to me, that it's equivalent.
Yeah, no, I'd be inclined to agree with you.
But it's still not.
Terminator 5, 6 on coming on.
What?
Terminator. No one's watched Terminator?
No.
Not watched Terminator?
I've seen the first one. I'm not seeing fucking 5 or 6.
I don't know how much we're on to.
No. It got bad after 2.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, in terms of, so that kind of, where did that come from? Somehow we got from consciousness to, we've been doing free will and consciousness for a while, and then we got to,
it's been a bit of a wild ride, hasn't it?
It has been a wild ride. But no, I'm intrigued by this kind of consciousness, and therefore what has intrinsic, or like, you know, does it have intrinsic value, and what bits of it have intrinsic value, and to what degree gives more consciousness or less consciousness, or, you know, what bits of consciousness have value and meaning.
Well, does this
What do you mean by value?
Well, value, I guess, is personal, right? But it will be what you think is good or bad. Okay. And whether you think consciousness is linked to that at all, or whether you think, you know, appeasing God is what's good, and not pissing God off is what's bad, and it's kind of irrelevant how you feel about it. You know, there are plenty of different sets of morality, but I think for me, consciousness is probably linked to, if not intrinsically, what's good or bad in the world quite strongly. But I am intrigued what other people think, and like how other people think kind of that is, you know, whether consciousness has any intrinsic meaning, and if so, how.
Well, I think I sort of get what you're trying to say, Rob. I think it does, I guess it sort of comes down to, well, I guess like if you kill a person, you assume they're conscious, and you wouldn't want to do that, because that's like part of the illegality in doing that, and the reason why sort of killing a cow versus killing a person is a different form. I know there's some vegans here. I'm vegan at the moment, so I'm sort of okay.
Is anyone here eating meat at the moment?
Well, I'm not fully vegan. We killed our
no, but is anyone like, you know, oh, you kill your chickens? You consciously...
For the first time a couple of weeks ago.
Fair enough.
It's good.
Oh.
It was very good.
Which one?
Two of them. So Carlos, the OG cockerel, and then one of his sons. What was the other one called? Charlie. Carlos and Charlie got the chop.
You're way too excited about her killing her chickens there, Zoe.
It was a whole deal, actually. There were many thoughts going through my mind. Anyway, that's a kind of a random offshoot.
Yeah.
But
she was sort of saying,
but it's true. But if chickens had the same amount of consciousness as a person, we'd think differently about whether or any animal.
Or if we thought chickens had
implicitly
the same
assume
amount of consciousness, then we'd think that.
Yeah. Well, this is an idea that's covered in a lot of things, isn't it? Sort of Westworld is a good one. Terminator a bit, but
yeah.
Yeah, but if other things are conscious, then it makes us
Runner.
think differently about how we interact with them.
So
we do assign some sort of moral value to conscious objects.
But the thing is, that's us though, as in like there are people out there probably who do not, which makes it a question: is it just is it individual, and why is it? We obviously assign that we don't want to kill a person because we think consciousness is important, and therefore we don't kill the person. But if you're a psychopath, you potentially may not think that. You may think your own consciousness is the only important thing, and so it kind of questions where does the value we put on it come from?
As in, is it an innate thing in conscious things or humans to assign value to consciousness, or is it learned? This gets very much into morality.
Yeah, well, we're always going to end up there, weren't we?
Yeah.
Final destination, or just next stop on the train. This is where, for me, like the definition of consciousness, or like which bits of it come into play, because all I know, all I feel like I can say on it, right? And this is sort of what we said in summer a bit, was like, I know I can feel good and I can feel bad. I can feel happy, and that's good, sort of by definition, because happiness is a good feeling in the dictionary. So I use that word. I can feel good, and therefore that's good, and I can feel bad, and therefore that's bad. And I can sort of, I think probably, although Mikey might disagree with the use of kind of probability there, but I think that other people can probably feel these things as well, and to a different extent, be it other thinking things. So be it, certain animals, computers, perhaps, if they're very intelligent AIs, maybe them as well, can probably, think, or can maybe feel as well. And if they can feel, that has meaning, but it's kind of how you can influence them and how you can affect that is much more severe with things like kind of theory of mind and kind of being self-aware and being conscious, than if it's just kind of a raw emotion without any kind of self-awareness or kind of ability to recognize other sort of self-aware creatures. So that's where I sort of think there's sort of like layers of consciousness and meaning. And I think for me, it kind of arrives at me being basically a utilitarian and ascribing different degrees of kind of capable happiness magnitudes, if you want to call it that, or kind of different degrees of possible utility, if we're going to be technical with our philosophical terminology there. That's where my kind of root of meaning would come from. But I'm really interested, because we've kind of had that conversation, I'm really interested to hear kind of, particularly Emma actually, and Max, where you would say meaning related to consciousness perhaps comes from.
I think, just as a point generally, obviously we've been talking about sort of the philosophy and science of consciousness, but more generally, like, can science provide meaning to people's lives? That's sort of the question we're getting at in a more general sense. And I don't think so. I think Emma probably agrees.
No,
I don't think it can either.
So I actually recently listened to, so I want to look much more into morality, because I don't know too much about it. However, I recently listened to Sam Harris talking about that exact question: can science provide the foundation for morality? And I have to say, I only got about 10 minutes in, but he did say something which I thought was very interesting, in that, as a kind of counter argument to the argument of, like, well, kind of where do you put this kind of scale of value, and how can science have something to say about something like morality? And he said, so if you imagine the worst possible scenario, the worst possible amount of suffering for every being on
Why are you
Earth.
smiling at this, Sil? This is a horrible thing to imagine.
So it was fine too. Basically, it's like the most amount of suffering for everyone on Earth. Now that is surely the worst possible scenario. If you agree with that, there must be something better. Therefore, you've got a scale going. Morality.
Yeah, so Sam Harris is an interesting one. He's quite radical, and he thinks that can basically provide a basis for what's right and wrong, like you say, which is, yeah, I think from a lot of the philosophy of science, it's not necessarily
He cops a lot of
compatible.
flack.
That when you try and take, when you try and take, so for science, scientific knowledge is value laden, is what they say is the terminology, and that when you try and apply science to like policy or to politics or anything, or to any sort of set of life, you're always going to be taking implicit or explicit moral values with that. But science itself is not, enough of a basis for like moral decisions. But it's an interesting point. Like, is like can science inform sort of right or wrong, or sort of good and bad and things?
So this is why I don't think, for me, science can be like a root of what gives value, but I think it has value in that it informs the decisions that affect what does, and therefore it's therefore worth kind of pursuing, because that can then inform decisions in a better way. You can have more informed decisions, and then you can, make better decisions that have better outcomes because of it.
I'd say I'd probably agree on kind of the same lines, but I'd place much less weight on using science as like a way of inquiry. I think it's one way in many, and because it only focuses on the measurable, the reducible, the objective. Like when you asked earlier in terms of what we thought about where moral or where value comes from.
I sorry to move on from that. I'm sure we'll get back to that, but my issue with the other ways of finding out things is, how am I supposed to be convinced by any of them?
How are you supposed to be convinced by science? I don't really see much. Like, I don't think you can be like.
No, but I can't be convinced of, but I can be convinced that other things are wrong by science, right? Or like very likely wrong.
But that's you personally. Like, other people might be convinced that like God is the true way. Like, why is that any less real?
Well, isn't the difference in that evidence? Because so to go back to what Emma was saying about just science focuses on the measurable. I don't know, to me it would seem, if something isn't measurable, how could it ever matter to anyone? Or how could it affect anything? Like, by definition, it has no effect on anything if it's not measurable.
Right? Yeah.
Measurable in the current framework of science, then. Which I would say can't measure a lot of things that we do know definitely exist. So
I mean, okay, if something could never be measurable, that's what I mean. So are you saying measurable with current technology?
Yeah, I see the point you're getting at, and I want to say I don't know. I don't know. I see the point you're getting at. It's a good point. I don't know.
The theoretical limit of science would be when there's nothing left we can't measure.
But the question of whether there is stuff that you can measure ever, I don't know.
But if it's stuff that you couldn't measure ever, then doesn't it have intrinsically, like Mikey was saying, sort of no real...
Does it actually exist?
Or does it matter?
Yeah.
Does it count?
And it could still exist. There could be, I don't know, say there could be two universes, and they're just completely independent, and one has no effect on the other whatsoever. And if you're inside one of them, you could never ever know that this other one exists, and it has no effect on you. So essentially to you it doesn't exist, right? because it will never be able to affect you. You'll never be able to affect it. It's equivalent to it not existing.
Is it though? Because are there ways that things could exist and have effects that we can't like measure or comprehend?
Well, okay, if there was one of those ways, then yeah, it would have meaning, yeah. But yeah, I guess it just depends on if you think those do exist, and we just have
whether you're affected by them, or like how you're affected. Because like if you're only affected once in a totally unpredictable way, how does that? It's sort of you can't do anything with that. It's something you can't then make decisions based on that. At least I'm not capable of doing that. So yeah, that's sort of why I ascribe to. I think we've said this before. That's sort of why I ascribe to science rather than other belief systems.
Yeah, but I think you can have other forms of knowledge that aren't science, which are meaningful. I think we've got sort of two architects here. Like architecture obviously isn't a science. It's got sort of aspects of engineering, of applied science, but it's still a valuable system of knowledge that has its own practices and beliefs and everything. And yeah, like I'm sure Emma and Zoe agree, it's not science, but it's still important. And I'd say it's important. Like we need other forms of knowledge because they provide different sort of aspects of sort of human life, basically.
I think architecture as an example, I'd say it's probably actually in its modern day form is actually kind of extension of scientific values kind of pervaded through culture. But I do agree with you that there are other forms of knowledge. I think of things much more alien to us actually, like for example Aboriginal dream time. Like we have I don't think any of us have any kind of knowledge of that.
Not extensively.
No. But,
as extensive as zero.
Exactly.
It's interesting Mikey's point earlier as well about how potentially science might theoretically have the capabilities to measure everything possible. That's the theoretical end point of science. However, the fact that we're pretty certain that there are things we cannot measure at the moment, even though we know they exist, right? So talking of dreams and stuff, like we know dreams exist and we know they happen. However, we don't currently understand them even through science, what they are.
We can measure them.
We can
measure.
But we can't understand them yet, right?
That's a very different thing, though. I mean, by measure, I mean be able to observe some effect.
And you mean the material, right? You'd be able to measure everything material, because I think we'd already come to the conclusion that with free will, you'd be able to measure it, but you wouldn't be able to, like, necessarily measure the mechanisms, because it'd be sort of. I mean, that's back to the beginning, and we ended up saying free will was illogical and didn't exist, and the rest. But yeah,
sure, yeah. Yeah, this is just talking about like a self-contained universe.
Yeah. But yes, no, back. Oh, sorry.
I was just thinking about like what Max said about architecture and it being a sort of different lens. Because yes, it does like use science in the sense that it uses engineering, but it's also creative, and I don't know how you can measure creativity through science and sort of that personal way of thinking about the world and putting it into a product. Like, how does science measure creativity?
Some would argue, like Rupert Sheldrake, that creativity is another kind of inherent emergent property of complex systems.
I'm just trying to think, like, is creativity a way of like in and of itself, like I think obviously it has an enormous amount of worth because it inspires and it fundamentally like often makes people happy and can often make people tremendously sad. And if I've just said that emotions have worth, then it clearly has, you know, a big impact on that. But I mean more as like I guess the conversation regarding sort of science and what it's worth, and then other sort of ways of thinking. I sort of mean getting kind of agreed upon knowledge. I think the lovely thing about a lot of the arts is that people can disagree on whether a piece of art is good or not. The whole thing is sort of, you know, subjective.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's it. It's subjective. Like the whole point of sort of architecture or any art is it has internal value. It doesn't necessarily have sort of objective value. Like it's based like the value from buildings and sort of artwork. It comes from it comes from something other than obviously from science. It comes from ideas of sort of conceptions of like how people should live, like what is beautiful, what is sort of what makes design good. Like obviously there's objective measures of how good a building is, but it goes beyond that as well.
Couldn't we put it in the scientific framework like that? You know, take a poll of people with like, I know it sounds super boring and lame.
You could do that, but I think you're missing. Then you do miss something of it that.
I was saying, is it not just the little dopamine in the brain?
No, it's the same point that Max was saying earlier about how you can explain all of these things through the mechanistic kind of whatever in the world, but that doesn't actually explain the thing, like what it's like, what that thing is like, the quality.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's different stuff going on, which is fine. I think that's the whole point of being. It's very deep. That's the whole point of being alive, isn't it? That we have stuff other than just explanation. We have feelings of
we have opinion as well as kind of agreed upon things. But this is if we're just dealing with the stuff that we all agree on. That's where I struggle to see where other belief systems aside from science, like opinion is like.
What's something we all agree on, Rob? What's something we all agree on?
See, you're going to be semantic here.
We're just going to disagree.
We all agree on analytic statements such as.
I want to say when I pick up this mouse and drop it, it's going to fall down and not float away. But I know you'll be like, what if it floats away, Rob? Or something we can all agree on. Well, as in the point is that society can come to conclusions with science, or at least that's why it's good. That's my argument for why it's good, and you're gonna, disagree by saying I don't think it's good, therefore I can't do it. Check my. But but yeah, no, that's in theory. I should be able to say that when I drop this, it will fall, and we can all agree on the fact that it's going to fall. And now I'm not going to drop it, so
we'll never know.
Ooh.
May have floated away, folks.
But Max, so I hadn't really thought about this, like kind of things we can't explain, giving kind of like this value to things like build like of the arts subjects and stuff, and then this being this kind of like untangible thing. However, is this not different for every single person, right?
Yeah, no, it probably is, but that's fine as well.
It's interesting because like one person, right? Say, obviously, the act of killing someone, right, is like that can be described scientifically. Like someone's heart starts beating, you do that by stabbing them in the heart, and then they die. However, as you say, there is this intangible thing that comes with it, which for us would probably be horror, shock, like sadness, hopefully, and like things like that, which, as we say, are not really explained what the actual thing is. However, for a psychopath, potentially, that's going to be completely different. And so, is it it's so what kind of gives it value in that sense?
I still think those values are like what kind of makes something worth doing. A psychopath will do something because they want to get the feelings that come along with doing that thing. And I think feelings, I mean, yes, you can argue that like everyone obviously will have a slightly different or possibly quite different experience of the world. However, there are evidently things which are also shared, and I'd argue like a large part of that experience is shared, and we can relate to one another and understand each other a lot, and that's how another way that we obviously have done come to kind of consensus about things in answer to Rob's question.
I think it's true. I think we do have a sort of a common so we do have something. Obviously we have stuff in like people have stuff in common. We might be separate, like there's a very simple like colors. Like if we all saw the color red, like we might like, we're not sure what red looks like to other people, but we all recognize what red is. So yeah, so I think from a psychological perspective, like obviously for most people, we have a shared common reality. That isn't the true objective reality, but it's common enough that we're able, due to evolutionary processes, that mean we have a good enough sort of view of reality that we can interact with other people. We can view the world in a way that means we're adapted to surviving in it. So like if we weren't able to have anything in common with other people, if we weren't able to view the world in a way that was meaningful, then obviously that isn't sort of evolutionary adaptive, basically. Yeah, and we wouldn't be, so obviously humans are defined by their sociality. I'll let Rob wants to jump in on the...
Yeah, no, the thing is, yeah, I was kind of struggling to find what to say, but I probably haven't thought about this like enough, and should probably concrete and more, be able to put my thoughts into more concise and actual words. But I because of the way I've lived, I think like your whole view on life is built off your experiences. Like that's all you kind of can base your view of life on in the world. And I just, it's all very individual, and like I think it's all views the world so differently. And I mean, it may have been because like my mum's a Buddhist and like very Buddhist, and I would have
what
said
sort
I was
of
Buddhist,
Buddhism?
like she is a she follows like a it's not, what's the modern one called?
It's not the modern tree ratner.
But like
Buddhism.
The core beliefs and stuff. Like yeah. And like the whole view of like everything is just like perception and like your own perception of things. I don't know. Maybe it's because I kind of grew up with that as well. But like I don't know. I think that it's just such a big part of how we view the world. And then I've also obviously had this science background for the last like 7-8 years of my life. Yeah.
But would you not argue, even in those two different things, like there's still so much common experience just in like being human and the fact we're all talking to each other and can relate to each other's emotions and all of that.
Yeah.
I think I'd say that the majority of experiences is shared in some degree.
Yeah.
As in, you say that people can have very, very different views and kind of subjective opinions of the world, but I don't think they're that far removed from each other.
Yeah.
I think if you've got like pure perception though, right, and you think the whole world is just your perceived thing, then how can you believe other people or like anything outside your mind exists?
Yeah, I'm not sure you can.
And therefore you don't believe that there are other people.
This is where I go down on like a whole nihilism route. I'm like, this is let's try and get out of this somehow. But
So
Well,
I don't
yeah,
think
'cause that's-
Buddhism actually believes that.
Some schools do.
I feel like some do. But
That's
yeah,
the whole thing with this new. Oh, there's like a. I listened to something really interesting yesterday about Buddhism in the US. There are like 1 million Buddhists in the US now, but 750,000 of them are like converts, and the vast majority of those are to a school of Buddhism that doesn't believe. Like I don't know the name of the school. It sounded a lot like the one you said, but then I'm not going to get into that. And the kind of the issue with this new school of Buddhism is a lot of the old schools of Buddhism think it's just entirely a kind of misinterpretation of it all, because it sort of says, well, nothing exists outside my mind. It's all perception. So I'm only going to do what's good for me. And so it leads Buddhism into this kind of streamlined belief system with kind of a hyper materialist, hyper capitalist kind of viewpoint of I'm just going to do what's good for me and I'm just going to be greedy and it's all just for me. And I was like, I find that really interesting how they've kind of managed to, I don't know whether I'd say pervert, but kind of turn a kind of the belief system into that.
Yeah, but if you think, yes, okay, if you think, sorry, what you were saying, if you, it doesn't matter because you're only viewing it like what you think matters. However, the thing is, I also think if you then believe that influencing those people again influences you, then you kind of do have to make decisions based on other people.
I think, Rob, that sounds like a sort of Buddhism taken a step further and mixed with like capitalism, individualism, and is, from what I know of Buddhism, which isn't like loads, I've read a few books, seems to be a sort of taking out from a lot of the rest of the framework, kind of cherry picking kind of that one piece, because like Sil said, and like there's a lot of Buddhism that's to do with like the not self, so everything is connected, therefore you are everything and everything is you.
I wasn't trying to say why it was good or bad or how it was related. I just said I thought it was really interesting the way it has been kind of interpreted like that.
But then I think actually that again shows that you can interpret things, and this kind of relates to like science in terms of how you look at evidence and receive that in a sort of framework, and depending on what kind of framework you already have, you can receive that evidence in an entirely different way. Well, not entirely differently, but in a different way. Yeah. Or maybe not be looking at the whole picture. So
that sort of stemmed from you trying to explain your life from your own experiences still, and then we all sort of spiraled out into Buddhism. I was quite interested by that. Can we get back to that?
What do you want to get back to?
You're explaining how you thought that, given you've grown up with both like a Buddhist and a more Western worldviews, seeing how different people can have very different perspectives on life. So I do think I kind of subscribe to it being very much how you frame things in your mind. Like if the thing is, like if this guitar fell on the ground and broke, Emma might be very sad because he can't play guitar anymore. I might be very happy because I don't have to listen to Emma play guitar anymore. It's completely different, because from my perspective, I view that in a completely different way, and therefore this world is just completely different to me because of my past experiences, and that's like that. I just have so far seen that in my life, and I kind of subscribe to that. But I think, as you say, Rob, I think if you view it in that way, kind of go down this route of like nihilism and like only you matter. But then I think it comes back to potentially if you believe people are inherently good. Because if people are inherently good, then actually you kind of
inherently want to help other people and be good for the world, and and think your actions influence others.
I'd almost go so far as to say you don't even need to believe people are inherently good. You just need to believe they're capable of being good.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Because I think there are plenty of people who are not inherently. But I also think that people in general matter because they're quite capable of being good and having said, you know.
Is it of being good or experiencing goodness?
They're a conduit for it, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You're no, that's a really, both is a really interesting point, because they can experience goodness and plenty of other things can experience goodness, but human beings are perhaps the things that can be good, do good the most that we know of, because they're the ones that can kind of think the most, if you see what I mean.
But the thing is, if we're talking about goodness, well, again, what is goodness? Because I would then say again that I think good, like your definition of good and goodness is again just so personal, and I think you almost have to. Like a psychopath's definition of good might be killing loads of people, or a serial killer might be killing those people, and
but then you're also intrinsically saying that each person's definition of good is a definition that is equally arbitrary and equally valuable, right? So if you are destroying a bunch of other definitions for good, that is in a non-arbitrary way bad. So therefore, murder and killing could be perceived as bad, which is where I think that kind of comes from.
Yeah.
This is very rare. I'm in a debate and I'm getting smiling approval nods from Emma.
It's just, I've heard him say this so many times, and I've not come up with a satisfactory.
Yeah, that was helpful. That was helpful. That was good.
That was good. I like that.
I'm glad I could.
Can you repeat that? So I got it down.
So you've got. I've got a definition for good. Psychopath's got a definition for good. Everyone has their own definition for good. And you're trying to say that they're all equally arbitrary and therefore all have equal worth. And if you're killing people or destroying separate consciousnesses with their own ideas of good, then you are destroying those ideas of good which all have intrinsic equal worth. And so for you destroying them is intrinsically bad.
Yeah, unless you believe in an infinite universe, in which case it's infinite amounts anyway, then it doesn't matter.
Wow.
But even
Sil's just trying to get out of killing someone, isn't he? It's an infinite universe. It's fine. The universe is infinite. I can do what I want.
Sil's trying to work out how he doesn't need to go into growing meat, so he can just kill all the animals and eat them anyway. Sort of, but you're still worth one, and they're still worth multiple of you. So relative to yourself, they're still worth. So even if
unless they're worth zero.
Yeah, and I was going to say they'll be worth zero then.
Your happiness is worth zero, so you're doing it as meaningless.
Well, this again is what I say is going into nihilism again. It's just
so it's either meaningless or you don't kill people.
Yeah, which is why I probably should just subscribe to what you said and be like, actually, yeah, if you kill someone, then if you're killing other goodnesses, then that is less
bad. Yeah.
No, I quite like that. That's a good bit. I might just subscribe to that.
You have to assume that other people are, equal to you.
Yeah.
That they're not all NPCs.
I was waiting for you at some point in this conversation for the last hour to hop in and be like, bold assumption. Why would you assume that they can also think?
Yeah.
I've literally been like, when's he going to do it? He's been crawling up like a snake. When's he going to come in and be like, ah?
Waiting for the time to strike. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it does. But that's something that you essentially, I feel, you have to build into your assumptions, because I'm not sure that's something you can ever prove or disprove. Yeah. So it's kind of up to you personally.
But that's the thing, like that is one thing where I'm quite happy to be like, no, I do feel like that is true.
See, that's very interesting, because you're saying I do feel like that is true.
Yeah, I'm basing it off my experiences.
Yeah, and I think that's like evident.
How very
How
unscientific
do you
of yourself.
actually make decisions and actually kind of decide on what is true and what is not true? And yes, like logic and evidence and whatever can help with that. But I think.
Emma, do you want to know how I think?
Go on, Rob.
Well, I want to know what Mikey says about this because he's a logic maniac.
Well, I was going to say quite a logical thing, but I'm interested in what Mikey wants to say.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean, all I was just going to say is accepting that there are limits to what we can ever potentially understand. And I don't know if this is actually relevant, but there's this proof of kind of the incompleteness of logic. And essentially it's been proven that there are things that are true that we'll never be able to show and prove are true. So this is essentially what every mathematician absolutely hates. But yes, I mean that there are some things that, and I think this is maybe one of them, kind of I would call it kind of like your like value function, like what you decide has intrinsic worth. I'm not sure there's ever any way to like logically get to one from no assumptions. You have to
or like how to value someone else as well.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's basically like egoism is you are one, like value one, everyone else is value zero, and utilitarianism is everyone is value one, and they're the only two that I can kind of.
Or anyone in between where you're value 1 and everyone else is value like 0.9 or 0.5 or.
I think that's what people actually do.
Yeah.
Is,
So the way I think about it is there's an arbitrary chance people don't exist. But if they don't exist and I assume they don't exist, then I'm doing really well. If they do exist and I assume they don't exist, then I'm doing horrendously badly. And if they don't exist and I assume they do exist, then I'm doing not quite optimally. So, and if they do exist and I assume, I think I've only covered 3 of the bases there. I'm trying to think which is the one I've missed out. So there's they do exist.
I see what you're saying.
And I assume that they do exist, in which case I help everyone else and it goes really well. They do exist and I assume they don't, in which case I don't help everyone else and they don't do as well and I cause a lot of problems in the world and that's bad. There's they don't exist and I assume they do exist, in which case I help them all and it's kind of for naught, but I still do okay out of it. And that's like not quite as good as if I had assumed correctly, but it's still not really a bad outcome. And there's they don't exist and I assume they don't exist, in which case I do really well and doesn't matter because other people don't count. So that's kind of like another optimal outcome.
There's also the one where you don't exist, Rob.
Everyone is value 0.
Yeah, all right. That's kind of meaningless though. So if we go back,
you don't even need to consider that one.
Yeah, the only ones out of the other 2, I do much better. I have a higher chance of doing better if I assume that other people do exist. So therefore, logically, I should assume that other people exist rather than just feeling it. But also, I'm not sure they do, so I ascribe them like a value of maybe 0.95.
I'm glad you managed to quantify that.
Like, I'm worth slightly more than everyone else.
95% of me.
I'm worth slightly more than everyone else, but like 2 people is almost certainly worth more than me. Maybe like a person and a mouse. Not really sure.
Is a mouse like worth more than 1 or something, Rob? Or
a mouse is probably worth a lot more.Maybe like a fish or a lizard, because they don't have like as good theory of mind or self-awareness. I don't actually know, to be honest. A cat and a person is definitely worth more than me, put it that way.
Wait, a cat plus a person?
Yeah. A cat is definitely worth more than 0.05 of me, like a lot more than that. So there you go. There's like arbitrary things going on in my head there, but that's kind of...
People do actually think like their life is valued over others, because I know we've had a discussion before, Rob, with you and your sister and stuff, but as in like...
Yeah, so my sister's a weird one where she's probably worth 1.001
Well, yeah, no, but as in just the question for these guys, right? Like, I think most people in a situation where they had to choose between their life or someone else's to die, that almost everyone would choose themselves. And why is that? If everyone's worth the same, theoretically, it doesn't make a difference. So what makes
no one's like a complete utilitarian.
Yeah.
Like I feel like because you could say, okay, either your mum can die, or two random people, in China who you're never going to meet can die. Yeah. And if you're a true utilitarian, you go, okay, I want my mum to die. Because,
yeah.
She's only one person, but who would ever realistically choose that?
Yeah. The other thing is you're having to assess how good it so you're assessing that everyone has that intrinsic value of they are a conduit for good, right? But you're also not then assessing how good the decisions they make are. Therefore, how good they are as well as their intrinsic value. So if it was me and some random person, I think I am more likely to do more of my own opinion of moral good than someone else. Therefore, my outcome of surviving is worth more than theirs. So I'm going to pick me. The only reason I sort of pick my sister is I think my life currently with her dead would be quite awful. And therefore, I'm not sure I think she'd probably have a better life knowing I died for her than I would knowing I'd sacrificed her for me.
I see what I mean.
If it was that's kind of where that decision goes.
That's why parents and kids would sacrifice themselves for their kid, because they would have
to bury their own child
if they sacrifice their kid, rather than their kids would have if they died.
Yeah. So there's more to it than just picking one and two, especially if you know people, because you kind of know that they're the value of the decisions they're likely to make and how that will affect others in the long term. It's like a kind of compound problem. But
I think is there something else as well? I don't know.
In terms of say a mother and a child, I would bet that it's more than just a mother thinking, my life will be horrible if I choose my child over me.
Oh, I think there's absolutely most people there's feeling. I'm just saying that this is how I come to the logical conclusions I do, and how that is an option, as opposed to, I think in most people's psychologies, the maternal instincts take over, and that's all that's rushing through their head, and the kind of emotions are so powerful, that they're not thinking, hold on a second, in this kind of train that's running towards my child, my life's going to be worse. I'd best chuck the child out of the way. They're just shit, my child's about to be hit.
That's the thing. It'd be interesting to see if logic would win in your situation, in the actual moment. You're saying this now in a theoretical sense, but, in the moment.
There's a really good book that I read over Christmas called Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion.
That sounds like a very broad.
Would really recommend it. And it does make a good case, I think, for a better world, where you could make said decisions, and people have made said decisions. I don't know if I'd have the willpower to do so, because I've never been in a position where I've had to, but I like to think I could. But it's entirely supposition. I have no evidence to support it. I certainly don't have a big enough sample size.
Anyone here die for anyone else? No. We're all selfish bastards. Brilliant.
Just
I think it depends, doesn't it? Depends on who it was. Like we've just been saying, basically, it's all contextual.
Yeah. What if that person had information that was then going to save? What if that person was the only person who could stop Donald Trump from pressing the red button and causing nuclear war? Would you then save yourself to save them?
Well, if you're going to die anyway, then you might as well either nuclear war or whatever other.
What if you're in a really remote island in the Pacific and the fallout's probably not going to reach you?
Rob, you're assuming that him pressing the red button and killing 6 billion people is a bad thing. Like you're
Yeah, that's such a massive assumption.
No, but like potentially the world would be better. Well, nuclear war, okay, but as in the like
You don't know the repercussions of actions.
that's the thing. You don't know the repercussions. It's such a complex system. Potentially, only having like 10,000 people left over in the world is actually a really good thing. Like, yeah.
Okay, so I was saying I meant it in like a theoretical argument. You saving them, they're going to do something that's really important, that's going to cause lots of good, but you are still just picking between you and them. But like, you know, they're going to be a better person than you are.
Yeah.
Forget that. Oh, I can always
think-
overcomplicate the system. Therefore, me.
I think the thing Sil said there is actually really interesting about, you know, maybe if there were 10,000 humans, that would be somehow better. Because if you kind of assume that, you know, every human is kind of net a bit happy,
Yeah.
kind of the logical conclusion is that we should just breed unlimited humans. Because, you know, if they're all conduits for happiness.
all do a Genghis Khan. Yeah. Well, actually, maybe Genghis Khan's fucking habits, but definitely not his killing habits.
Yeah, not
definitely
the
kills more
killing
than he. Yeah. Bad example.
But it's like, you know, if you follow that to its logical conclusion, we should be, you know, trying to colonize every planet and, you know, just making machines just like full of people, you know, kind of like Matrix style, you know, just like as you know, as compact as possible.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like if you, I don't know, it's one of those things. Whereas, and so I think kind of the only thing that leads to a kind of reasonable outcome is if you assume that kind of like, some people will have net good lives, but some people will actually have net negative lives, kind of like negative happiness lives. And, you know, if we had massive overpopulation, then people wouldn't generally have.
And there's like an optimal concentration.
Yeah, literally.
And you want to hit that optimal concentration, and it's actually slightly less than like optimal life, right? Because you're going to want a few more than like everyone at like maximum happiness. So if it kind of just teeters below, you've got because if you've got, I suppose actually no, it depends how large the maximum happiness is.
And also theoretically, you should try and colonize loads of planets and stuff, because if there's a theoretical maximum for Earth, then
But doesn't this come back to the consciousness debate? Because this is only humans' happiness.
This is the thing.
This is very good point.
Yes, very, very true. Very true.
And also, what value do you ascribe the potential maximum happiness of other conscious beings, and is that relative to how conscious they are?
And is happiness what matters in the universe? Is it important? Or like,
Well,
I think me and Mikey, I think, do.
I think you guys' happiness is, and I must say, I think for me, often when I'm mulling these thoughts over, it comes back to happiness is the thing that matters, really. But
yeah.
The other thing is, I like having the discussions about happiness. I like trying to talk to people about how else they would measure it, and then kind of why? Oh, because it makes me happy. Is often the way those conversations end up. Like the really good example I heard recently, I can't remember if it was on Four Horsemen or not, but it was, heaven and hell. It's like they're making these decisions because it's morally right, but fundamentally they're not making decisions. People don't make, Christian people and anyone else who believes in a heaven and a hell, there's a strong argument to say, at least I think it's a fairly strong argument to say, that they're not making the decisions because they think it's wrong or right and God's saying so. It's because they think it's wrong or right, and if they do the right thing, they'll end up in eternal happiness. And if they do the wrong thing, they'll end up in eternal sadness. And it's the magnitude of happiness and sadness that's actually motivating them.
I think it's a very strong, well.
But I mean, obviously, that's only one belief system, and I'm sure they're, anyway. How long have we been on now?
A couple of hours, probably.
We might have to have you guys back.
That was cool.
Yeah, no, this has been good.
Yeah, this has been so much fun.
Well, we want to thank Max and Mikey for coming on today. It's been a lovely conversation. I think we can all agree. We started off first dabbling with science and how free will kind of fit into that, and if it didn't fit into that, and then we kind of moved on to consciousness, which was a very interesting part of the conversation. It went on for a good hour, I think. And then we finally began to dabble in morality and kind of happiness, which I know a lot of our conversations kind of end up in always. And I think we've all decided that we kind of wanted to kind of continue that into the next podcast. And we're hoping maybe Max can join us again, and we're thinking of having a theologian from Oxford come and join us as well. And also, we want to say that if anyone was very interested by our conversation or has some input they want to put into the conversation, please contact us and we can have you on. We'll talk about whatever you want to discuss. And yeah, we hope to hear from you, and we hope you enjoyed the podcast.